In order to know which buttons were actually pressed on the controller, I need to set up a mapping of button and axis IDs to button and axis names. I will be storing these mappings in JSON format inside of a config file that will be pulled into my new module, so in the same directory as my source files, I will create a new file called config.json. In this new file, I will create an object literal that will have a number of different configuration properties. For the button and axis mappings, I will create a new property called mappings, and it will be assigned an object literal with two properties, buttons and axes. The new buttons and axes properties will then contain arrays of objects with an ID property corresponding to the button or axis ID returned from gamepad, as well as a name property that will be assigned a string containing the actual name of the button or axis being pressed or moved. There are 14 buttons on the controller and 6 axes, so I will need to add the appropriate number of mapping objects to each of the arrays. To actually get the IDs for each of the buttons and axes, I'm going to fire up my test application and see which ID is logged for each button that I press and axis that I move. It's a bit tedious, yes, but luckily it's something that only needs to happen once. Now I'm just going to quickly speed through this as it takes a little bit of time to do, but to give you an example, if I press the Y button, I get an ID of 13, so for my first button mapping object, I'll plug in a value of 13 for the ID and a Y for the name. Now if I hit the B button, I get an ID of 11, so I'll plug that mapping in next. The ordering of the buttons listed in this file do not matter at all, as I will be using a utility function here shortly to extract these mappings, which does not care about the order. Alright, now I'll just quickly fast forward through the rest of these. And when the mappings are all said and done, you should have a configuration that resembles something like this. The LB and RB buttons are the two buttons on the top of the controller just in front of the trigger controls. The left stick and right stick buttons are the buttons inside of the left and right joysticks, which you can get by pressing down on each of the joysticks. And then finally, the left, right, up, and down controls are for the directional pad, not the joysticks. Now for the axis mappings, there are 2 trigger controls and 2 joysticks. I have 6 mapping objects already predefined though, because each joystick has X and Y, or left and right and up and down axes, so there will be one mapping for the left joystick X-axis, one for the left joystick Y-axis, and the same for the right joystick. The joysticks are really sensitive, so it may be a little difficult at times to know which ID to grab. As an example though, if I move the left joystick to the left, which corresponds to the X-axis, the ID I get back is 0, so I'll add that mapping to my config file with an ID of 0 and a name of left_X, which means left joystick X-axis. And if I move the left joystick up, I get an ID of 1, so I will add another mapping for the Y-axis with an ID of 1, which I will just call left_Y. Now you'll just need to repeat the process for the right joystick, which should give you an ID of 2 for the X-axis and an ID of 3 for the Y-axis. The final 2 mappings that are needed then are for the left and right triggers, so if you just press each of those, you should get an ID of 4 for the left trigger and an ID of 5 for the right trigger, which I'll just call LT and RT respectively. Alright, that completes the controller mappings, so let's see how we can actually utilize them in the controller module.